Hi, this is Dr. Kingsley Oturu. I'm going to be talking today on mitigation versus adaptation, which is better for fighting climate change. Remember that conversations lead to solutions. What if I told you that there were two different ways of fighting climate change, and that choosing the wrong way could have catastrophic um, implications? And these two ways are called mitigation and adaptation. So, what exactly is mitigation? Mitigation means taking human action to reduce the sources of greenhouse gases or to increase the things that remove them from the atmosphere. So, mitigation tackles the cause of climate change. For example, look at if you take the analogy of a leaking tap. Um, Mitigation is like fixing the tap from leaking versus using a mop to deal with the water that's on the floor. So, how can we be involved in mitigation? Mitigation would involve anything that we can do to reduce greenhouse gas emission. So, firstly, we can reduce our energy use. So, simple things like turning off equipment, turning off light bulbs, reducing unnecessary car or air travel, reducing our dependence on fossil fuel. So, even in the healthcare sector, reducing high emission anesthetic gases such as nitrous oxide, which is one of the greenhouse gases, can help in mitigation. Second thing that we can do is that we can be more energy efficient using better insulation, energy efficient equipment, aerated equipment, um, using heating equipment such as heat pumps, air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, and better building design to ensure that we have more energy efficient strategies. Thirdly, we can have cleaner energy. So replacing fossil fuels with alternative energy. So this would include things like solar panels, windmills, other green sources of energy. Then fourthly, we can change our behavior. So we can walk, we can cycle, we can use public transport, we can reduce unnecessary consumption, and we can also embrace the circular economy through reusing, repair, refurbishment, remanufacturing, and recycling. And then finally, we can use legislation such as net zero legislation, zero waste legislation, carbon capture technologies, and information to accelerate change. So, mitigation is essentially reducing emissions and increasing carbon removal to slow climate change. So, this is different from adaptation. Adaptation is different. Adaptation is taking action now and in the future to reduce the harmful effects of climate change. So, in other words, mitigation tackles the cause by reducing the greenhouse emissions, while adaptation tackles the consequences. So, if you use an analogy of a flood, uh, as we said earlier, mitigation is like turning off the tap, but um, adaptation will be like putting flood barriers to stop a flood from entering into the house, to stop water from entering into the house. So, what are some of the things that are involved in adaptation? Firstly, you have infrastructure. So, this could be building flood barriers, improving drainage, designing buildings for solar heat, and using cooling and solar shading. I would also argue that even using things like fans and air conditioning can be part of infrastructure. Then, secondly, in adaptation, we have public health interventions. So, this could include heat warning systems um, and protecting vulnerable populations. For example, ensuring that people are appropriately vaccinated for vector borne diseases and appropriate public health um, preparedness. Also, people can also protect themselves, for example, using sunscreen and having, for example, wearing light colored clothes in heat waves. And then thirdly, information, warning people about heat waves, floodings, and other extreme weather events, and ensuring that people can and communities are empowered to deal with migration and displacement as a result of climate change. So the more greenhouse gases we release, the greater the long-term climate change that will be locked in. And then we'll need better adaptation to cope with the impact of climate change. So adaptation has its limits. We can build flood barriers, but what happens if the flooding becomes more extreme than the barriers we have designed for? So from my perspective, I believe that mitigation is more empowering. Everybody can turn off the lights, everybody can recycle, everybody can remanufacture, everyone can take their goods to the repair shop. So mitigation is very, very empowering. Everybody in the community can be engaged in mitigation. Adaptation, on the other hand, may be a little bit more complicated. Building flood systems, being prepared for emergency situations. Most of those strategies require government intervention and release of massive amount of funding. Notwithstanding, they are both important. They both work in collaboration with one another. On the one hand, we need to mitigate the climate change by reducing our carbon emissions, but then at the same time, we need to be prepared for climate changes that are taking place and ensure that we have appropriate strategies to adapt and deal with the consequences of climate change. So what do you think? If you had £1 million, if you have £1 million, what would you invest in? Would you invest in mitigation, adaptation, or both? I want to hear from you. Put your comments in the chat box below. If you've been helped by this presentation, like, share, and leave a comment below. Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. And remember, climate conversations gives rise to solution. Keep safe and have a lovely day. Thank you.